come to Nature 12, and we're trying to appreciate and understand something which is more primordial than fundamental. And it makes all the difference in the world. And it is a technique of recalibration which naturally allows for transform operators to come into play and to participate in a natural way for variations in the integral cycle. And it is all due to the fact that this is the way that nature works, nature happens. The caveat is that nature is different from existence. Existentials are definitely objective forms, and they occur with formal specificity down to every level of their structure and up from every level of their structure, including proportions, constellations, communities. It is difficult, though, to understand that you cannot change forms by working on the forms. You change forms by working on the process out of which those forms emerge in the first place. This is universally true. On the social level, it is a source of great error in civilization. Since the time of Sargon of Akkad, some 2350 BC, there has been this prejudice that somehow you can put a number of cities together and make an empire, and that empire will have this political form of a vast civilization, that everyone will fall into step with that, and it's not true. It became exacerbated 2,000 years later because the classical Greeks at the time of Solon, about 600 BC, who radically reformed the city of Athens. And very quickly, Athens became a political powerhouse, and its populations swelled, and it became enamored with the idea that one could have a dominant city with its political form, and that everyone else would be better off under the aegis of that political form. It became exacerbated when the city of Rome decided that it was the city and that its empire was the political structure by which the entire world should be controlled. And reoccurringly, the last 2,000 years, again and again, the forceful, aggressive pushing of political forms on human life is a chronic flaw. It is an error. It is true that communities of human beings are objective forms, and they certainly have their objectivity. They can have stability, and over quite a long period of time, but it is not because of political form. And you cannot change people. You cannot change individuals. You cannot change groups. You cannot change a population of people. And the larger the community, the more you cannot force change upon the forms of social structure through working on the political forms. Political forms are mental forms. They're mental objectivities. And those forms come out of a process called experience. And experience is primordially a feeling-toned language shareability among populations of people. And that feeling-toned language of experience, because it is shareable, because it has a relationality to it, the mind is convinced that it can tighten that relationality through ideological, mental doctrines that then will tighten everything in the social world, will tighten the culture to become a civilization, and tighten a civilization so that it can expand and become a larger civilization, can become an empire. All of this is untenable. All of this, in fact, is irrational. And the entire tradition of it has so mastered the way in which experience has been truncated, and the traditions, especially of education, have been betrayed, that by now, in the early 21st century, the techniques of sophisticated manipulation are so refined, and the absurdity of the irrationality of the ideological forms literally condemn all political structures on the planet to being a junkyard. This is a very severe criticism, and it's one that we're looking at the roots of today, because the process of experience has a template that it follows, and that is the process of nature. And we're looking at nature to understand that it is a process, and that nature is different from existence. That while nature is a process, existence is very objective, is very formal. Existentials are definitely formed. They really objectively exist, and the basis for their existence largely is because what has emerged out of nature is a complementarity that is able to reposition itself as a polarity. If you don't have positive and minus, you don't have any way to have electrical flow. You don't have any way to have the ability for atoms to form, for particles in the first place, and then for atoms to come together as molecules, and molecules to develop the chemistry, and then finally the biochemistry, and then cells, and the whole development of life, right up to us, right here, is an extraordinarily clear event and form by 2004. What is difficult is the getting back to getting a realistic tempo of the way in which nature as a process occurs. And that as nature occurs, there is a mysteriousness that's there, not because it's not understood, but because it is understood and is mysterious. Now we're looking at two people who are still alive. We're looking at Lynn Margulis and James D. Watson, and their respective work has really been formative all through the latter half of the 20th century and into the 21st century. And it is apparent now that there is a threshold which we are passing through where the capability, the facility, is going to be staggering. the casualty of this staggering facility and capacity will be all of the false social forms on the planet. None of them will be able to hold because the basis of all of them is going to be dissolved. Because human experience, which is the process out of which those forms came, is going to be expanded and to be refined on orders of several thousand times. There will be no structures by 2020 that will not be dissolving anywhere, on any level. So we're pioneers. We're in something we can't even call an education anymore because an education is a form. We're in a learning. And one of the qualities is that nature allows for learning to occur. And so the ritual comportments of action that come out of nature, that emerge out of nature into formality, have remarkably learning capacities. And they learn in several ways. For one thing, we'll see when we get to ritual in just 2 weeks. We're doing Nature 12. Next week we do an interval to give an articulate spacing. We're going to use the Tao Te Ching, my translation of it. And then we're going to come back with the beginning of ritual and take a look at the way in which the whole purpose of ritual is to ensure that existence formally is stable. That it really is what it is. And we're trying to use Chinese terms for this. We're saying that nature is Tao and ritual is Te. And that these are very good terms for us because they do not have yet any kind of weight or watered down or splintered quality in Western languages. No Western languages have ruined them so far, though on a popular level they have been mishandled and misco-opted for especially since the 1960s. It's still not long enough to dissolve their usefulness. It's important for us to understand, because we're using Watson's The Double Helix, and we're using Lynn Margullis's book, Symbiotic Planet, to understand a little bit of how these come together in terms of Tao and Te. How they come together, how they interface, how they work, is a template of how experience allows for the symbolic mind to make forms. And it's very difficult because the confusion that has come in the Western tradition almost forever is the confusion of looking at the forms and trying to manipulate the forms and to ignore the process out of which they came. China is exactly the other side of the coin. The Chinese characteristically have looked at the processes and ignored the forms. So that the West is very good at making forms, and the Chinese are very good at allowing processes to occur. The number one word in the West would be something like substance, and the number one word in China would be something like qi. The flow of energy in a process is masterfully handled by the Chinese. The objective exactness of substance is one of the triumphs of the West. The Greek word for substance is ousia. And at least since the 5th century BC, the West has been able to look with great exactness since the time of Aristotle, with great exactness, and to define ousia. But the original definition of it was a process of making an outline of it, a boundary. If one could follow the boundary of something, then classically one had a sense of what it was. So that for people like Pythagoras or Plato, as it was for Socrates in between, definition was a matter of following the bound of something by discovering it, by dialoguing about it, by teasing out the motion that one would go to make the journey around the bound, to adventure on the liminality of it. And when one had done that, one would have the sense then of what this was. But by the time of Aristotle, the emphasis was not on that bound, but on the substance of what it was. It is this thing and not that thing. And the sense was that if you know the complete shape, you don't have to follow the bound. You don't have to follow the boundary at all. And this allowed for an optical illusion in experience, where one looked to see things and not how those things came to be. And without factoring in how those things came to be, the process out of which they come, and to understand that if you want to change a form, you have to work with the process out of which it comes. Because processes accept change. Because the ultimate process is nature, and nature is pure change, like an ocean of change. And in that ocean of change, energy, which is so colossally complete and so spread everywhere that its process would have an effect of something objective coming out of it, that its tone is that of zero. Its tone is that of emptiness, but not an emptiness of nil, but an emptiness which cannot be measured. It is so complete that one could say that it is also infinite. And so the zero infinity of nature as a process, as Tao, is extraordinarily difficult to address with the habitual Western mentality that one is looking at a thing. We're going to look at nature. We're going to characterize nature. Nature cannot be characterized. When we talk about nature, when we use language, the best language to use is experiential language, the mythic language. Myth is the right way in which experience talks about nature. And it has its beautiful quality in that words in experience function the same way that genes function in organic existentials. Genes and words are very similar. But that genes function the way that they do because they have come out of, they're working in paired chromosomes, sets of paired chromosomes, and that out of those 23 sets of chromosomes, all the genes working within them respond to DNA, to the double helix of the structure of DNA, and that all of that is coming forward from an RNA world before that, And all of that comes out of a very interesting mix where before there were cell life forms with cell walls and nucleuses, there were archaic life forms. They used to call them archaeobacteria, and now they just call them archaea. And they had no cell walls, and they had no nucleus at all. So they were like splotches. In fact, they're called, all their names are versions of a plasma. Mycoplasma, thermoplasma. And these are living original life forms that eventually became bacteria when bacteria developed nucleuses and cell walls. And that when they developed cell walls and nucleuses, sex came into play in life. Because they had to find a way to repair their DNA, because that early life structure 3 billion years ago, there was no protective envelope of the atmosphere enough to prevent ultraviolet light from injuring and maiming and destroying DNA, so that it had to find a way to repair itself, and sexuality was a way to repair DNA. Not the only way, but one of the ways. And that its function was that in repairing DNA, it took a combination of two. It took a pairedness of two that were quite distinct, in fact were quite polarized, but had the ability to recalibrate their polarization into a complementarity, and that complementarity then would be fertile and birth of the zygote, the new cell could proceed. In all of this, nature, as distinct from existence, is very difficult to follow for our mentality and our society and our education and our history, because we tend to think that something like this is mystical and to be holding it at arm's length. It's not mystical at all. One of the great things about James Watson is that he has lived long enough that we can follow from the double helix, from the structure of DNA. There has come about a development of the human genome, and the Human Genome Project, this is the cover we showed last week of it, from the structure of DNA to the human genome was somewhat less than 40 years. It's extraordinary. There's a new volume, DNA, by James Watson, who tries to bring everything up to date by 2003. Lynn Margulla's latest book that came out in 2002 is entitled Acquiring Genomes. The upshot of being able to have genomes is that the development has been so staggering that one can have something like this. This is the March 4th issue of Nature, the International Journal of Science. Here is a review of one of the articles in here, and the review is called Reconstructing the Wild Types. Because life has been going on for 3 billion years on this planet, and because it's important to us to try and understand what is life. What is it here? Because very soon we're going to be finding life on other worlds, other moons, other planets, and we need to have some place to start from. The difficulty is that over 3 billion years, everything has become very complex, so it's difficult to find the original bacteria, the original archaea. And here in the article, which is entitled Community Structure and Metabolism through Reconstruction of Microbial Genomes from the Environment. There's at least a dozen people who have contributed to this article. And the very first sentence, microbial communities are vital in the functioning of all ecosystems. However, most microorganisms are uncultivated and their roles in natural systems are unclear. Here, using random shotgun sequencing of DNA from a natural acidophilic biofilm, we report construction of near-complete genomes, and then they give a bacterium and an archaea. They went to the Sierra Nevada mountains in Northern California. They went to an old mine, and in the effluent runoff, the water runoff from this old mine, they found very primitive, very early original strains of a bacteria, which they have the complete genome now of, and an original archaea, which likewise they have a complete genome. And so for the very first time in 2004, we are able to look at a primordial life form in its complete readout, but it isn't like a readout one time. In order to get the structure, the genome, one has to have readouts that exceed 100,000 times, sometimes several million times. So you have to be able to go in and find some way to take an enormously complex structure. Even the earliest archaea, bacterium, has more than 76 million base pairs. Notice they're always paired. G and C, A and U. They're always paired together. And that these base pairs, this paired sequence, when one runs it complete, 76 million base pairs, you would have, in this case, the bacteria that was here is a early leptobacterium, Leptospirillum group 2. The discovery of how to go into this 76 million base pairs, or sometimes it's several hundred million base pairs, and to find a way to fractionate that structure so that one then has sequence bits that are short enough that one could make an analysis of their sequence. Say, in the case here, they were dealing with somewhat under 800 base pairs at a time, and they would take samples of 800 base pairs at a time from the 76 million, and out of this fractionation, they would then run these little snippets of sequence base pairs through advanced computers, and to reconstruct from that the indication patiently of ways in which sets of these base pairs, they said in the article, they took about 1,163 of these snippets together, making a scaffold, and then taking a number of scaffolds together, finally getting the whole genome, and to understand well, then this is what the structure is, and then to be able to check it by going through it a number of times. What comes out of this is the understanding that because sequence is with universal base pairs, there are repetitions that are possible, and that these repetitions, these iterations, are very accurate, but that if there's an inaccuracy of even one base pair, it changes the way in which that reads out, which means it changes the application of it. But something even more startling is that because all sequences are of the same universal base pairs, bits of some other sequence can be factored into a given sequence and join it and be a part of it, and you will have a new sequence. And that this lateral adoption and exchanging goes on all the time. Because that exchanging, that changing in that way, comes out of the way in which nature occurs. So that the ritual action of the sequencing forms of life mean that they are changing all the time. And not just changing because they have this lateral capacity to borrow from each other. There are mutations that occur naturally, like wild cards showing up within a given sequence, and so there can be a modification within. In Watson's book, he points out that it is extraordinary for us to realize that the difference between any human being alive today is so minuscule in terms of the whole capacity, the whole genome. 98% of all of our DNA is in areas that do not make for variation. Only 2% of it. And out of that 2%, 99.9% are shareable between all of us. So that the biggest difference between us is incredibly minute, and yet turns out to be as great a variety as we see today and enjoy. We do not believe that this is so yet. Very few people understand that this is so, and very few understand that when you're dealing with ourselves, you have to begin not with the ritual actions that make forms, but you have to go back to nature and recalibrate yourself to the zero-ness of the fullness of nature before you begin to do your counting, before you begin to establish your forms. Because that gives you a chance then to get used to the fact that if you concentrate on the processes and you put transform operators into the processes, they will work. And if you put transform operators that are capable of being imagined creatively to do something really fine, to do something that's very important, they will work. The difficulty with this, of course, is the great fear that if you tamper with nature, you're going to ruin its form. The truth is, nature is not a form, it's a process made to be played with. It plays all the time, but it plays with change, not chance. Nature is not a game at all. And the application of game theory to nature is one of the most stupid things that anyone could do. In Watson's The DNA Story, documentary history of gene cloning, one finds the link between DNA, like the double helix, and gene cloning, like in the molecular biology of the gene. Watson's fifth edition of Molecular Biology of the Gene just came out in December of 2003, and it's now 900 pages. What's important is that the genome, the index of how all the genes and all the chromosomes with all of their possibilities make a constellation that can be known. Not just known, but known creatively so that one can play with it creatively, set up a great cry in February of 1975. And here on page 25 of the DNA story, Watson goes into the Asilomar Conference, which was the first time that the world realized what was coming, what it was facing. That all of the genetic forms of all organic life can be changed if one goes into the process of nature and allows for that to emerge in the ritual action of sequencing. And that sequencing goes into all of its functions of objectifying and making entities. One will have a new entity. The first entity was a designer tomato. And when that tomato was shown, it was ominous because here was the beginning of what has been called Frankenfoods. We've made a Frankenstein, and that our capacity to do this is somehow unnatural. The deep understanding is that it is natural, and that's what's so peculiar about it. That we are in a natural process when we participate with that, but that the participation with it needs to be fully conscious. It cannot be on the basis of politics. It cannot be on the basis of religious forms. It cannot be even on the basis of existential forms. It has to be on the basis of natural occurrence, and nature has a wonderful reality to it. Nature does not emerge partialities or untruths. Only something that is true, is real, will emerge from nature naturally. You can force a form to be a Frankenfood, but you can't force nature to produce a Frankenfood. So if you go through the process in a harmonic way, you will come out with, as the saying might be, something edible. We're going to take a break. It's a very difficult thing to understand, but the whole key to this is recombinant DNA. And Watson was, again, the star player in the sense that his book on recombinant DNA foresaw an entire melee that has, a sense, erupted. One of the most difficult things for us to understand is that our planet is not the only source of life. And even though life is all of 3 billion years here, there have been star systems for at least 13 billion years. And if our survey recently of the last 7 or 8 years is any sense whatsoever, this leaves about 12 billion years for life to evolve all over the universe. So that there are life forms beyond number, literally. And there are life forms like ourselves who have been making creative life forms longer than this star system has been in existence. Let's take a break. Let's come back to something remarkable when we look at the earliest recordings of major social doings of civilization, and we look at the entire planet, and we look at the last 5,000 years, it is dominated by men. All of the early chronicles are chronicles of the king. The king's victories over enemies. The king's addition to the kingdom. And when it stepped up a whole order in differential consciousness to become history, the very first history is about men and their wars. Thucydides' great Peloponnesian War. And the last 2,500 years are dominated by men and their wars, their empires, their power, their ability to conquer. And now the game plan is to have a new world order where the entire planet is conquered by a clique in a political way. And all of this is betrayed by genetics, by the human genome, by the development of the way in which we're able to appreciate nature. The fact is that men's conquests throughout the ages are minuscule compared to the genetic achievement of women. In fact, by 2000, it was apparent through detailed studies that women are 8 times as likely to carry genetic material from one community to another. They're more mobile, 8 times what men are mobile. And this, of course, fortified discovery that Jane Goodall did with her chimpanzee studies over 30 years. The males patrol the boundaries and guard their territory and herd the females into the center, the females and the young. But the females from the center of this community are free to go to a different territory. And yes, they'll be herded by the males in that territory to the center, but they will have gone from one center to another. And that apparently human female populations have done the same thing for 150,000 years. They are 8 times as mobile, and they are the carriers of the way in which the network of humanity for our species, all the way back through many filigrees, through many resonance of species, back more than the 70 million years that chimpanzees have been around, who share 99% of their DNA with us. The women are able to go from center to center, to carry variation from community to community. And it's not just that they travel, it's not just that they are mobile, it's not just a geographical action, it is in the very structure of the cells of human beings and all of our predecessors, all the way back through all the primates. In the notes, I've excerpted this comment from Watson's 2003 volume DNA. Little bodies called mitochondria, which are scattered throughout the cell, outside the nucleus, and produce the cell's energy. Each mitochondria contains a small loop of DNA, some 16,600 base pairs in length, and because there are from 500 to 1,000 mitochondria in every cell, but only 2 copies of the genome proper in the nucleus. Mitochondrial DNA, mtDNA, has long been a staple of studies of human evolution. And in order to study this, mitochondria DNA is carried through the female line, not through the male line. It is only carried through the female line. So that the very way in which cells process energy is inherited and kept in a constant variant change constellation is through women, through the female lines, and all species. And when this was brought into doubt some time in the 1990s, there was an Italian lab that was able to develop, through a man named Peter Underhill, a way of looking at the male chromosome, the Y chromosome, and to trace back the male genetic lineage, and they found a confirmation that it is the females of the species, not just the species, of all higher species who carry the networking and the constellation of genetic mitochondrial DNA, and that all the variations are indeed from lineages that go back to a very small base. For our species, for Homo sapiens sapiens, there are, they've been called the 7 sisters of Eve, about 150,000 years ago in Africa. For the hominid group of species, not just Homo habilis and Homo neanderthal and Homo sapiens, but the Australopithecus and all of the higher primate forms, the ancestor goes back a little more than 5 million years ago. One female, about 5.5 to 6 million years ago. So that all the way through, one comes to a deep realization that the development of civilized political forms on this planet has been a nightmare of irrationality. There was never a chance that any of it could have worked. None of it was natural. There's not a chance that any of it could have been forced. It doesn't jibe with experience. And the mental ideologies made on the basis that it has got to work because this is the right idea is complete arrogant nonsense. And so here in the early 21st century, the next civilization is a civilization that must be natural. It must be in accord with actual reality of experience. And its rituals must not be projected or retrojected, commandeered, ideological-based doctrines, whether political or religious or social or whatever it is. We are now in a position by early 2004 to understand that reality is extraordinarily Tao Te real. The latest issue of Nature, March 11th, has a lead article, a cover article, Atom-Photon Entanglement. An ionized atom and a photon emitted from it have a unique entangled shareability, and that even though the photon may be emitted from that atom and go off who knows where in the universe, they will always carry a vibe that is a unique signature of their togetherness. The fact that shared presence occurs on the subatomic level all throughout the universe is a very clear vision, is a message. It is a handwritten letter by reality to us of one sentence. You cannot produce something that is unnatural and against experience, and to think that because of power, of ritual enforcement, and of ideological purity of ideas that it's going to hold. Now, in the past, because of the primitiveness of civilizations, it took a while for that to fall, for those to crumble, for those to not work. But the tempo of history is much speeded up. Where it took about 500 years for the Roman Empire to fall, the next irrational civilization will fall in less than a generation. There's no sense in going through all the expense and effort to make something that has a life expectancy of just maybe a decade. Even if you could make a new planetary order of some political or religious form that is doctrinaire, perfected through game theory and everything, it wouldn't last out the decade. So the crisis on the planet is not a crisis of being taken over by tyranny, but of those who promulgate the waste of life and of resources to try to make a tyranny, for them to understand that it is useless, is nonsensical. This is a much deeper thing. And so the emphasis is not on a superior doctrine, but on the process of learning. The future belongs to those who learn. And it doesn't matter what scale of power your group has, it is useless from here on out on this planet, in the star system. There will be no interplanetary empires. There are going to be no galactic wars. All of that are fantasy, arcade game projections from the irrational past. So an education like ours is a cycle of learning, of going patiently through, because we're trying to recalibrate from the zero of the process of nature all the way through not only the whole ecology of the integral cycle of nature, but the differential cycle of consciousness as well. It all needs to be recalibrated. And recalibrated not to some kind of a doctrine or to some kind of a power, and especially not to ideas that are held up as promulgators, and then you should understand what's being done because don't you get it? This is the idea of it. So the whole process of our learning is not to know beforehand and to only know as we mature through the process of doing it and recalibrating ourselves, much like reality has recalibrated itself. So that nature has a particular occurrence that is real before any phenomenon are established in existence at all. And you could say, let's use the Chinese terms. We began with the I Ching and Thoreau. Next week we're going to have the interval with the Tao Te Ching. Let's use the terms Tao Te. That Tao Te are not a polarity. They are an entanglement. They are entangled in such a way that their pairedness presents a complementarity. And when that pairedness is there in that complementarity, it's as if the ionized atom of Te retains in complementarity its relationality of change, of changeability, of variation. of freedom with Tao. And because it does, Tao, like a photon, can go off into its mysterious infinity, and Te will still carry the unique signature of its pairedness in itself. So that now Te has a possibility of complementarity in and of itself, a meeting of opposites in a complementarity, but also a positioning of opposites in a polarity. So that existence has a pair of modes, one of which is polarization and the other is complementarity. And when in complementarity, it shares a great deal with that complementarity that is there with Tao Te, but also has access to participate unknowingly but really with the entanglement of the mystery. And if one is in the process in this way, all other processes of which this double cycle is capable are able to not just be harmonized, like the harmonization of experience with nature, so that the saying is that one is at one with nature, and that's a bad language. One is zero, infinite, open in the occurrence of nature, and there's no oneness there. There can be a oneness, but when that oneness comes out, it assumes the phenomenal form of its action sequencing, capable of lateral and mutational variation always, and capable of relationality as well. So that sequence is real, so that mutation is real, and that relationality is real. And it means the constellation of variant sequences is always an actuality, is always real. And because life, because reality, because all existentials, organic or inorganic, occur through frequency of energy iteration, constantly into form on all levels, and that those forms in their constellation objectively also are iterative, it means that one can count on understanding that there are resonant sets, like the scaffolding of the snippets of the DNA that we talked about earlier this morning. You can count that constellation as a structure in its exact registry and in its exact proportional relationality will be as real as reality itself and will hold. It may have some kind of a durational limit to its form that will be a part of its reality, but it also can be extended, or it can be shortened, it can be variant. All of, they used to be called factors, but they're not factors. They are like arcs within a resonant set, and that set will always have in its deepest and highest mode a harmonic. A harmonic that is capable in conscious forms, two different ways to be understood deeper than what the mind could understand it. The mind is not the arbiter of structural understanding at all. Art and science are both much more capable than the symbolic mind. The symbolic mind's great virtue is not that it understands structure, but that it's able to take operational transformers that improve its understanding. And that mind, by learning, improves its understanding through artistic critique and through some scientific analysis. Both of them are differential forms and not integral forms. And not only does the mind as a form take that learning and improve its structure, but it has a synergy now with nature, because nature also accepts those transforms. But the transforms that nature accepts do not come from the forms of differential consciousness, but from the processes. From the processes of vision and the processes of history. And to make the mental mistake that, well, history is what's written down in books, is a gross misunderstanding. Or to think that vision is just given to a few gifted people every once in a while, and this is always like a revelation of some kind of religious expansion or some kind of political expansion. Both of those and many other correlates to that are also misunderstandings. Processes in reality have a vibrational quality of being able to be modulated. And where experience and nature modulate integrally, vision and nature modulate in not an integral but a differential way. And history is able to modulate with experience in a differential way. So that vision, we'll see when we get to it, beginning of next year, vision transforms the mind and remodulates nature at the very same time, so that the mind and nature now have an entanglement that comes because of consciousness that they did not know before, but now it's knowable. It's knowable because the mind has memory and because nature will emerge existential things that will be able to be truthfully understood by that mind's memory. This is very deep. And perhaps the easiest way to understand it is that when Te becomes polarized, then you have, using the Chinese language, then you have a yin-yang. But that yin-yang polarity is not carved in stone. It's not a doctrine. That yin-yang polarity has a flow between them of energy, qi in the Chinese, and that flow of energy keeps that polarity, that polarized form, keeps it stable as long as that qi flows. You can only turn on the light if the electricity is working. If the positive and negative pole of a battery or of the plug or whatever the cycle is working. Otherwise, it does no good to have light bulbs, lamps. The same thing in the actuality of reality. It does no good to have forms that will never work because they are unreal. And all of the forms that have been made on this planet up until this time, very few of them are real. Mostly it's a fantasia, sometimes quite nightmarish. James Joyce once said, "History is a nightmare I'm trying to wake up from." But it isn't history. It is the ideational projection of a mentality onto experience and then calling that history. And that is a very, very deep thing. In addition to yin, yang, because they are polarity within Te, and Te has this ability to have a complementarity with Tao, when the polarity of yin-yang is shifted to a complementarity, you bring Tao into play, not automatically, but instantly, effortlessly. And so there is no energy exchange. There's no qi that is involved in bringing Tao into the complementarity of yin-yang. It just doesn't record. It doesn't record as energy, it doesn't record as form, but it does make the process richer. So that the process of experience now, when yin-yang are in complementarity, because it is more nutritive, realistically, what comes out of experience is a different quality of the symbolic mind. That's called the real mind, a true mind. And a real mind, in its knowing, understands without effort that it is open as well as it is objectively structured and formed. It is structured to include openness everywhere within its structure, so that it's available for operational learning, transforms more than ever. It's called being prepared to be prepared. One can learn how to learn, so that there's an exponential higher order that's available. And it does no good then to give it a label and call it supermind. It's unnecessary to call it supermind. It's unnecessary to say, well, now one has an IQ of several thousand instead of, say, 130. Though it may work out to be that kind of quantification, if one wanted to do that, it is beside the actuality that what you have done is that you have opened up the mind to be infinitely boundless in its ability to learn. And that has a deep, entangled synergy with nature's mysterious protein quality of this universal ocean of change. And so the mind and nature come together so that the mind not only emerges out of experience, but it emerges out of nature pristinely for the very first time. So that the natural mind is quite extraordinary. It is not limited even by enriched experience, but is universal, immediately. It is real everywhere in the universe instantly. So that the universe becomes not just the mysteriousness of nature, but it becomes the mysteriousness of a cosmos that has a personal quality to it. Because the mind that is open right away is open because there is not just the transform of vision as a process coming into it, but there is a synergy between the differential form of the artistic person and the symbolic mind. One becomes a creative artist in terms of one's symbolic capacity. This completely changes. Instead of there being a character that was able to be deformed with ideological handles and manipulated and settled just the right way so that they feel very comfortable doing what they're told, you now have someone who is able to distinguish what is real and what is not, and are not manipulable. They're not handleable. The saying one time in classical philosophy in the 1950s, if you had a room full of Socrateses, you would have a melee, because they would all be questioning each other all the time to see if what you knew was what you knew. And because the principle is of Socratic ignorance, it would be not a room full of doubt, but a room full of inquiry, constantly boundless. there is a deep form that occurs other than polarity and complementarity that occurs in Te as well. That form is called similarity. In addition to polarity and complementarity, there is a similarity. And there's yet another form that comes into play, and that's called symbiosis. So that you can have polarity or complementarity, you can have similarity or symbiosis, and in these, there's a disclosure. While similarity can be two likes together, two yins together, or two yangs together, or a yin and yang together that are just similar in the sense of a yin and yang who have a friendship, and not necessarily raise it to the level of a complementarity, which always produces fertile birth. One can have yin and yang that in similarity are close friends. But when one comes to that symbiotic quality, it is in the symbiotic quality that community emerges realistically. So it's in symbiotic communities that you find realistic forms in existence for the very first time in a truthful way. Truthful not in terms of the mind, not in terms of some idea, not in terms of some ideology or some doctrine or even some principle, but truthful in the sense that a symbiotic community that emerges out of the process of nature will be quite real. And this is one of the themes of Lynn Margulis's work for the last 40 years. And her symbiotic planet is subentitled A New Look at Evolution. And when you put it into just very brief, short perspective, here's a volume from the MIT Press, 1991, edited by her and one of her grad students. Symbiosis is a source of evolutionary innovation, speciation and morphogenesis. That one is now beginning to see that there is an understanding which is realistic, but it has to work its way up through an ecology of integration so that it comes to the mind in an integral way which is realistic and not some preemptive artifice that has been commandeered out of experience and then forced onto ritual action, forced onto existence, and then the mind says, we're in agreement, this is the way things should be, and they're that way, so that must be real. There was a beat poet in the 50s, and her favorite phrase was, that's garbage. So that here is Lynn Margulis. This is Academic Press, and this is Global Ecology towards a Science of the Biosphere. Biosphere. Understanding that there is a sphericality that's available, and that the sphericality is generated out of an exponential of the pairedness that goes to the third order. It's like 2 cubed, making 8, is the first vector in a matrix that is able to generate a real sphere in terms of life, in terms of ourselves. Here, published in Heidelberg and Berlin, edited by Lynn Margulis, Proceedings of the Third Conference on Origins of Life, Planetary Astronomy. So you're beginning to understand that when you begin to look at nature as natural, what comes out of it are existentials that are realistic, and they're able to be understood by the mind, not just in a practical way, not just in a true way, but in a real way, a real integral. Able to then be looked at in terms of a structure that can not only be understood, it can be critically understood, it can be further analytically understood to any degree of exactness. Now, if you take most of the emergent modes come paired, but the symbiotic community mode comes in a triplet. It has a threefold quality of emergence, so that you get, in polarities, you're dealing with twos. If you're dealing just with polarities, the twos can be double, they can be dual, they can be split, they can be paired parallel or opposite. And similarities have that quality as well, of two-ness. But complementarities have the pairs paired, that is to say they are two squared. They are capable now of geometricity, of a square, of a two squared relationality, interrelationality. They constellate now into that kind of real geometric patterning, establishing a plane. And if you take 2 cubed, then you come out with 8, and 8 is the generation of sphericality. It is a rich enough vector like the 8 trigrams to be able now, in its square, to generate a 64 quality, like the 64 hexagrams or the 64 triplet codons of DNA. Now you have something which can be expressed not only the square of 2 cubed, which would be 2 to the 6th, but you can express the same thing as a different relationality, 4 cubed. 4 cubed is 64. So you can move from 2 cubed to 4 cubed, from 8 to 64, and you begin to see that structural senses hold, not because of the mind's idea, but because of understanding how the integral develops itself naturally. When you come to 64, one can also express it as 8 squared. It's also 64. So there are all kinds of proportionals and relationalities that have deeper than an ideological base, deeper than a doctrinal base. They have a realistic objectiveness to them that can not only be expressed, but registers. It registers in reality. And if experience is generated from that field of actuality, of action sequences, which really do then make forms that are actual and hold, then the experience that comes out of that will be a good food for the mind then to make itself. And when that whole integral ecology, when it is whole, it is laced with effortlessness. There is Tao all the way through it. One could never put one's finger on it, but one would always have that amplitude of dimension to understand. And one of the amplitudes is that it takes consciousness without destroying or interrupting its wholeness. The integral is untouched, except that it becomes more creative and more memorable. Then it produces art instead of ritual. And when it produces art, the personal form becomes that of a work of art. And one of the great things about similarities, even on the differential, is that the artistic, spiritual person vibrates to the cosmos, which is differentially real as well. There's no mistaking it, because it's not any kind of correlation based on identity. It's a correlation of actuality. Then you have not a universal man or universal woman. Then you have a real cosmos that has all kinds of mitochondria that can process energy, called spirit beings. More next week.